Every blacksmith's forge you have ever seen in a movie has one thing in it that never makes it onto the screen: a ledger. Because the real business of medieval blacksmithing was not swords and glowing metal. It was something far less romantic. Repair contracts, guild dues, raw material debt, and a monopoly on the one skill an entire village could not survive without. Take a single village smith in, say, 1350. His most common job was not forging a sword. It was reshoeing a horse. That job took him about 20 minutes and used maybe 2 pennies worth of iron. He charged 4 pence, a 200% markup, and nobody blinked because he was the only person for 15 miles who could do it. That is the whole business model in one horseshoe. Scarcity of skill, sold at whatever the market would bear, with zero competition to undercut him.
Hold on to that word, scarcity, because it explains everything that comes after.
Before we go further, one number worth sitting with. A medieval blacksmith did not just sell labor. He sold labor on top of a raw material he did not control. Iron ore had to be mined, smelted into workable bloom iron at a forge he often did not own, and hauled in by cart. Charcoal, not coal, was the fuel of choice, and a single working forge could burn through the wood output of several acres of managed forest a year. Smiths in some regions were legally required to buy their charcoal from a specific licensed supplier at a fixed price, whether the harvest that year was good or bad. So before a smith had earned a single penny from a customer, he had already paid rent on his forge, a fee to the guild, and a markup to whoever controlled the fuel supply. The hammer and the fire were the visible part of the business. The invisible part was a small, brutal supply chain that took a cut before the smith ever touched a piece of metal.
Blacksmithing was not something you could just decide to do. It took 7 years of apprenticeship, unpaid, living in your master's house, doing the worst jobs in the shop, pumping bellows, hauling coal, sweeping slag, before you were ever trusted near a real commission. Then, once you finished those 7 years, you did not just open your own forge. You had to be accepted into a guild. And the guild was not a professional association in the friendly modern sense. It was a licensing cartel. It decided how many smiths were allowed to operate in a town, what they were allowed to charge for standard jobs, and who was allowed to train the next generation of apprentices. If you were not a guild member, you could not legally sell your work in most towns at all. And in some cities, guilds successfully lobbied for outsiders' goods to be seized at the gate. The guild was not primarily protecting quality. It was protecting scarcity, on purpose, because scarcity is what kept prices high for everyone already on the inside.
So the apprentice, the one doing 7 years of unpaid labor, was not being trained out of generosity. He was being used as free labor, while the master collected commissions using the apprentice's own hands. And then, at the end of 7 years, the apprentice had to pay an entrance fee to the guild just to be allowed to compete with the man who had just finished exploiting his labor. Every stage of that pipeline had somebody already inside it collecting money from the person trying to get in. This is worth pausing on, because it means the guild system functioned less like a school and more like a toll booth with a 7-year waiting line in front of it.
Now, the actual work, day to day. A village blacksmith's real income did not come from swords. It came from 3 unglamorous, recurring categories: horseshoes, tool repair, and agricultural ironwork, hinges, plow blades, cart fittings, wheel rims. This was recurring revenue in the truest sense. A working horse needs reshoeing every 6 to 8 weeks without fail. A farm's iron tools break constantly under normal use and need repair, not replacement, because iron was too expensive to throw away. The blacksmith was not selling you a product once. He was selling you a subscription to keep your entire farming operation running, and there was no alternative supplier within a day's walk. That is a business model with almost no churn, built entirely on geographic monopoly rather than product quality. Swords and armor. the part everyone imagines when they picture a medieval blacksmith, were actually a tiny fraction of most village smiths' income, and for a very simple reason. Almost nobody could afford them. A quality sword took days of skilled labor and cost roughly the same as several months of a laborer's wages. The people who could afford weapons and armor were knights, lords, and eventually standing armies, and that business did not belong to village smiths at all. It belonged to master armorers working in cities under direct contract to nobility, and that is where the real money in medieval metalworking actually lived. Here's the number that changes how you should think about this. A city armorer producing a full suit of plate armor for a knight could charge the equivalent of a small farm's entire annual output for one commission delivered to one customer. And when wars broke out, and medieval Europe was almost never not at war somewhere, armorers stopped selling to individual knights one at a time. Kings and lords began placing standing orders for weapons and armor at scale, essentially the medieval version of a defense contract, with delivery schedules, quality inspectors, and penalty clauses for late shipments. That is where blacksmithing stopped being a village trade and became something closer to an early industry with real capital behind it, specialized workshops, dozens of employees, and revenue that dwarfed anything a village smith would see in a lifetime. So who actually got rich in this system? Not the apprentice, who worked 7 years for free and then had to pay for the privilege of competing. Not the village smith, who made a steady but genuinely modest living reshoeing horses and patching plows, month after month for the same handful of families. The real money sat with two groups. First, the guild masters, who controlled entry into the trade, set the price floor for common jobs, and collected fees from every smith trying to operate legally in their town. Second, the city armorers, who held direct contracts with lords and kings, supplying entire armies at scale, and who were often wealthy enough to sit on city councils themselves. Everyone below that tier was doing skilled, essential, physically brutal labor for a stable but unremarkable income. Everyone above it was capturing the value created by controlling access to the trade, not by swinging the hammer. Now, the nuance, because the honest version of this is more interesting than the simple villain story. Not every smith was permanently stuck at the bottom. A skilled smith in a growing town could genuinely climb, take on his own apprentices, win a reputation for a specific specialty like locks or cart fittings, and eventually train someone who goes on to become a master armorer himself. The guild system was restrictive, but it was not a fully closed caste. It functioned closer to a very slow, very controlled promotion ladder. And the men who ran it were not villains twirling mustaches for the fun of it. They were protecting a trade that took 7 hard years to learn, from being flooded and devalued by untrained competition selling dangerously bad work. The same monopoly that kept prices artificially high also kept quality high enough that a farmer could trust a horseshoe not to snap and injure his only horse on a market road, which was a genuinely serious economic risk in an economy where one horse could represent a family's entire net worth. And there is a version of this that echoes surprisingly directly into something you already understand if you have ever played a game with a crafting and leveling system. The blacksmith economy was, structurally, a skill tree with a gatekeeper standing at every single branch. You start as an apprentice with 0 market access and 0 income. You grind for years doing menial tasks that build hidden stats nobody sees. Hammer control, metal reading, heat judgment, none of which show up as a number, all of which determine whether you survive the next tier. You cannot sell anything on the open market until you clear a licensing gate that costs money you do not yet have, which means you are stuck grinding until someone above you decides you are ready. Once you clear that gate, your income is capped by local demand, low-value, high-frequency jobs, until you specialize into a higher tier, armor and weapons, where the client base changes entirely, from villagers paying in pennies to lords paying in contracts with real capital behind them. The players who got rich in this system were not the ones with the most raw skill at the anvil. They were the ones who successfully climbed into the tier where they stopped selling labor by the hour and started selling controlled, licensed, scarce access to people who could not get it anywhere else.
That is not a coincidence, by the way. That is simply what a functioning medieval trade economy actually was at every level, from bread to iron to law. It is worth sitting with because most people picture blacksmithing as a simple craft: hammer, fire, sword, done. The reality is, it was one of the most tightly regulated, cartel-protected professions in medieval Europe, with its own licensing system, its own supply chain politics, and its own capital class sitting quietly above the men doing the physical work. And the people who did the most physically demanding labor in it were almost never the ones who ended up wealthy from it.
So next time you see a blacksmith in a movie forging some hero's sword by candlelight in one dramatic night, remember what was actually happening in the real version of that shop. Most days, it was not swords. It was horseshoes, plow blades, and a ledger of repair debts owed by half the village, paid in coin, in kind, or in favors. And the man swinging the hammer was almost never the one who ended up wealthy from it. The guild master collecting his fees and the armorer holding a royal contract were playing an entirely different game, several tiers higher on the same skill tree. If you found this one interesting, drop a like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And if you want to see how another medieval trade quietly ran on the exact same playbook, gatekeeping, licensing, and controlled scarcity dressed up as quality control, the guild system video is a good place to go next. See you in the next one.